Hi, everybody. My name is Bill Tavener, and I am the president of the Sex Ed Lecture Series. And we are here today to talk about our new certificate program, all about sexual orientation and sex education. And I'm joined today with the instructor of the course, Dr. Karen Rain. Hi, Karen.
Hey Bill, it's great to see you.
Good to see you too. So tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, how you got into sex ed.
Okay. Well, hi, I'm Dr. Karen Rain. I have a PhD in educational psychology. So I went into grad school thinking I was going to go into research and then had a really terrible professor tell me that you could not be both a parent and a researcher. She was wrong, obviously, but it sent me on a different path. And so I ended up graduating not really sure what I wanted to do. And a friend of mine had a daughter who had a pregnancy scare as a freshman in high school. And my friend was bemoaning the lack of comprehensive sex education in our town, which was Austin at the time. And she was like, her school doesn't teach it, and Planned Parenthood will do like contraception education, but they're not doing this comprehensive model that I like and that I want. And so I thought to myself, I basically have a PhD in educational psychology. I could probably figure out sex education. And so dove in and really just fell in love with it. So this freshman in the high school, and her family were my first clients. And I started doing sex education in Austin. I kind of fell into providing sex education through the psychology department at Austin Community College. And then I met Bill and started, everything else that I do now, which was, fortuitous and amazing. And I've been actually kind of reflecting on it a lot recently.
We've done a lot of things together.
We have.
Although what I've noticed is that our names don't appear on the same cover of the book at the same time, even when we're working on them in different ways. But I was reflecting, like I think it's been over 10 years since we've actually co-authored or co-edited something together. So time to do that again.
It absolutely is. Yeah. And then, sexual orientation and is one of my areas that I really like talking about. I came out as an adult, and that was a really kind of formative experience, and I think gives me a unique perspective into the experience of being in adult relationships that are heterosexual and adult relationships that are same sex. And so it's a really different dynamic in my personal life, but also in just in the cultural world of things. And so I'm excited to be providing this certificate program that focuses on this topic of particular interest to me.
When you think about when you were growing up and the sex education that you had, was sexual orientation addressed at all? What was it like for you?
Yeah, so I don't think that I've told you all these things, Bill. Like, this is going to be a new moment of sharing with you. My family was really inclusive. My mom loves to tell the story of me being a 3-year-old in the early 80s out on the street yelling at my neighbors that two women could get married, which they demonstrably could not have in
Yeah,
the
and
80s.
not in
But
Austin, Texas.
well, that was in Dallas, but yeah, like definitely not in Texas. And nevertheless, like that was my vision growing up, that same-sex couples were welcome and valid, and ultimately no different from couples that were heterosexual. And so that was my early childhood experience. And then of course I came to realize, well, actually they can't. They can't get married, can still be couples. Nothing about it ever seemed untoward or problematic for me, which I think is unique as a young person in Texas in the 80s and the 90s. We still lived within the social milieu of like Will and Grace, which I've recently gone back and watched the original series of, which was, not great representation. We're
Mm.
just going to go that way and say that. And certainly there weren't representations of lesbians and families as heads of families in the popular culture, in the media, that were accessible to me at any event. So this milieu of like, yes, being queer, we weren't using that term at the time, but being queer is valid and moral and accessible, and queer people didn't have access to the things that I know were very important for me. And then I grew up Unitarian Universalist. And so my religious context was also one of welcoming inclusivity, where, we were transitioning into the Our Whole Lives program, and all of my community at that level was also very supportive.
So you had family support and you had community support within religion and elsewhere. How was the school life and the curriculum different, or was it different?
Well, the 80s were a unique time in the history of sex education. And with the movement into CSE being much stronger in the 80s as a result of HIV and a realization that sex education was demonstrably life-saving in this really clear and important way. So I probably got some of the best sex education that Texas had to offer.
Oh, okay.
Maybe in history in the 80s and 90s, there were condoms in our schools. It was really very open. And then George Bush Jr. came into our governorship and really shifted that when I was in high school. But I had kind of gone through all of my sex education at the time. So he really moved into an abstinence only perspective in the late 90s. But I had already gotten kind of the best that there was to be offered. And so, while sexual orientation was not explicitly included in our curriculum, there was never anything problematic that was talked about in terms of it. It was a very biological sex education that I received at school, and pretty judgment free.
How would you assess that versus the national landscape today? Like, where are we at in terms of both inclusivity in sex education as well as teaching about sexual orientation?
In terms of the national landscape, we have a lot of divisions. We have places like Texas where if you are going to talk about sexual orientation, it must be through a negative lens. And then you have places like Massachusetts, which is my new home. Hello, Massachusetts, where the recommendations are a positive dialogue around sexual orientation, but it's not required in either way. So there's this wide division in our country in so many things that are considered political, and sexual orientation is something that is considered political, and sex education is considered political, additionally. So what kind of education a young person receives is very contingent on where they live, which state they live in. Also, are they in a public school or private school? Also, their school district's requirements, and then their principals' perspectives, and then who's showing up in the room. Because I guarantee you, there are teachers in Texas who are giving a really good sex education around sexual orientation. They're just doing it illegally. And there are also places here in Massachusetts where young people are getting negative perspectives around sexual orientation. And so, who is actually that teacher in the room matters so much. In Austin, there was this one teacher who, and this often falls to the phys ed teachers who are often not given the training that they need to do this kind of sex education. That there is one particular teacher in Austin ISD who very classically called in sick every year when the sex education topic was on the docket for that day and had a substitute do it. And so who even knows what was being done there?
Yeah, yeah. If it was covered at all, or if it was let's watch a movie, or yeah, wow.
Yeah.
So when you think about how sex education should be taught, including sexual orientation, and both in terms of a topic, because I think we're talking about two things. We're talking about as a subject that's integrated with all other learning, and we're also talking about making sure that everybody in the room feels welcome and represented, and that we're talking to their, unique identities and experiences. What's your vision for addressing sexual orientation in the best way that we can?
I want to start by saying that often when people hear about teaching around sexual orientation, they assume that we're only talking about queer folks. And I think it's really important that we include heterosexuality as a sexual orientation. And so acknowledging that that is, you know, a thing that in fact a much larger percentage of the population experiences. And we don't need to be shy about that. We don't need to be hesitant in addressing that and acknowledging that. So, sexual orientation, everybody has one. Everybody has a sexual orientation. We all carry it with us every day. What that sexual orientation is varies dramatically from person to person. And acknowledging that as part of our sex education curriculum is super important. And celebrating it, I think. Finding ways to be celebratory around sexual orientation is really ideal.
And what do you mean by that? What
So
is celebrating?
being like, you're experiencing attraction to someone, and that attraction is beautiful and fun and life-giving. Like, well done, you. You're not experiencing sexual attraction, and you feel clear in that, and you know what that means in your life. Well done, you. Like, let's just be enthusiastic about people's experiences around attraction and not attraction, as opposed to talking about it as like this heavy thing that is indicative of, social trauma and religious trauma. Like, we do need to acknowledge those things. Yes, absolutely. And it can be something that's celebrated.
I love that. I love that expression. Well done, you. I think that should be the title of our next book. Well done, you, or this course.
Yes, yes.
So tell us a little bit about what you're envisioning with respect to the course structure. What can participants expect when they come? We're talking throughout Pride Month, so it's every Tuesday and Thursday. I know that, but tell us what's happening in class and outside of the class.
I have a syllabus. So I've organized all of our topics. I'm excited about them. I think they're going to be interesting and fun. And so in class, we'll be talking about the ideas that are in each of our days. In between classes, there'll be readings and there'll be videos to watch that kind of focus on the topics at hand. So we're going to start with our first day is called Pride and Protest, a brief history of sexual orientation, just to kind of give us an idea, like what are we wading into here? What is the history of the dialogue around sexual orientation? Like, when did it start? What did it look like 200 years ago? What did it look like 50 years ago? What did it look like 10 years ago? Because we're like, this topic evolves so quickly,
Yeah.
and staying up in that moment of right now is important, but being grounded in our history is also really important. So then we'll talk about teaching the ABCs of sexual orientation, which is asexuality, bisexuality, and coming out, and all of the other letters of the alphabet. And then we'll have
Do we have
sexual.
something for every letter? Do we have something for every
Uh,
letter yet?
I will make something for every letter, Bill. I will be sure that this is a thing that we get. Um,
Fantastic.
And then we have sexual orientation and K through 16 classrooms. So I'll probably actually change that to pre-K through 16 classrooms. So that's inclusive of early childhood, but it's also inclusive all the way up through college. And I
Okay.
had really great experiences in all of those ages classrooms. Most of my experiences at the college level, but I've worked with kids and I've written curriculum with kids all the way down to pre-K.
Well, tell
Um,
us what pre-K looks like in terms of like what kinds of things, because I think people who oppose sex education, people who vilify non-heterosexual sexual orientations tend to imagine the worst
for sure.
when we're talking to younger people. So from your lens, when you're talking about sexual orientation with younger learners, what does that look like?
It does not look like telling them about what it means to be gay. That's not what we're doing. We're not talking to them about their sexual or romantic attractions. That is not what we're doing in pre-K. None of that is uh, useful, appropriate, um, you know, have implications for the very young child. It is much more about looking at family dynamics and saying, what do families look like? Who are people who you love? Who are people who your friends love? And why is that relevant? Who are people who love them? And so for the kids who have gay parents or queer parents, it's really validating to be sure that they feel and their family feels seen within that space.
Yeah.
It's about acknowledging that there are people who you want to be friends with, and there are people who you feel really connected to. And that building of explicit understanding around friendship is what eventually turns into an explicit understanding about other kinds of attraction. And so, with preschool kids, it is often gender bound, but not always. And we can talk about that. We can talk about, what does it mean if your best friend or someone who you love spending time with is the same gender as you? What does it mean if they're a different gender than you? And so these are the beginning seeds of conversations about sexual orientation in that age appropriate way for 3 and 4 year olds.
Thank you, Karen, for that. That's so important. Let's hear more about the course too.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. So we're going to talk about sexual orientation in older adults. One of the things that I've really experienced here, moving from Texas to Western Massachusetts, is that here we see elder queer people, which we didn't see in Texas.
Interesting.
There weren't grandparents, there weren't great grandparents, there weren't even really parents in Texas. Uh, Kind of fitting into that generational role as role models, as educators, as community support. And here, they're all over the place. It's really amazing to see what a change it makes to feel like somebody in a generational trajectory that fits in that context here that we didn't ever have in Texas. So I have this really personal connection to this idea of uh, sexual orientation and older adults right now that I'm really excited to dive into that topic.
So you're really taking a lifespan approach where we're talking about
Yeah.
families, family compositions for younger learners, and life experiences for older adults, the spectrum of life.
Absolutely. You know, I really take the position that sex education is a spectrum conversation, and we have to be talking about it from cradle to grave. And if we're not, we're missing huge pieces of what it means to be human.
Are you imagining that some of your participants will be also working with participants, individuals across the lifespan, and some will be working in the schools, and some will be working with perhaps older adults in a community center?
I mean, I hope so, you know, like to see who signs up. But
Yeah,
yes, all of those folks are invited. All of those folks are welcome. All of those folks will have things that are specifically geared towards them. And a lot of kind of surrounding knowledge is going to be relevant to everybody. For example, the next week was going to be sexual orientation and sexual health. And this is also relevant across the lifespan, you know, not down to pre-K so much, but definitely from, you know, middle school and high school all the way up through older adulthood. And
yeah,
so we'll be talking about what sexual orientation means around sexual health across those many years.
yeah, yeah. Is there anything else that you want to talk about with respect to the live presentations that you're going to be giving and the live discussions?
I am really excited about the next day, which is going to be teaching while having a sexual orientation. You know, as I pointed out, we all have a sexual orientation. And so, you know, what does it mean when we carry that with us into a learning space as a facilitator, or we leave it at the door? And all of us kind of have those options of checking it at the door or bringing it in with us. And there are times and places when each of those options is appropriate. And so let's kind of dig into that and think about what those different options mean for us and when we want to avail ourselves of the different trajectories.
And as I think you've been saying over and over, that applies to people of all sexual orientations.
Yes.
So, for example, like if I may, like an example of heterosexism at play might be the assumption that a heterosexual teacher can have I don't know, a picture of their spouse on their desk, or freely refer to their relationship, whereas someone who is lesbian or gay or bisexual or another orientation may feel restricted in doing so, depending on the community and the context. And so what's your messaging and teaching or the discussions that you want to have around that?
Well, I think it's first it's important for folks who are heterosexual to acknowledge that if they're walking into a classroom and talking about a spouse and using pronouns or using a gendered name, they're informing their students of at least some piece of their sexual orientation. You know, even if I mean, they might well be bisexual or queer or a number of other sexual orientations, but they were in a relationship that lives in the moment with somebody who uses he, him pronouns and she's the, she, her, you know, or the other way around. But they're giving information about their sexual orientation. And that's really the question here is what kind of information about our sexual orientations do we want to present? What do those presentations mean for our students and, you know, a wide range of students? And how are we making explicit choices about that rather than falling into I easily talk about my, you know, different sex partner without questioning it, without realizing that I'm giving information. No, I think we all need to be thoughtful about that process and acknowledge, like, yeah, sometimes we do want to be open with our students about who our partners are because it's a part of our life. And that personalizing the context can be useful, but it's not something that we should ever do by accident.
Right, right. There should be thought and intentionality between everything that we're talking about, and to be aware of how it's landing for different students.
Right. Yeah. Right. So, if we're showing ourselves as being in a heterosexual relationship, what does that mean for our queer students?
Mm.
As opposed to playing a pronoun game, and what would that mean to our queer students? And what do each of those options also mean to our heterosexual students?
You also have asynchronous learning for this course. What can you tell us about that?
Well, I have loads of videos from the Sex Ed lecture series, and I have loads of readings from all over the place.
Hmm.
And so there's websites to explore, there's research to explore. All of those are we're making sure that you have access to all of them. So if it's research that isn't readily available online, we have those downloaded as PDFs for you. And there's a lot of really fun stuff going on. So, I can like name some few, but just trust and believe that it's substantial and I'm hoping a really fun way to spend Pride Month is to really be
Yes.
diving into these ideas around sexual orientation, spending that month focusing in on um, what does it mean to be thinking deeply about sexual orientation? What does it mean to be a queer youth or, a queer adult or a queer older adult? And what does it mean to be a heterosexual youth and a heterosexual adult and a heterosexual older adult? Where do you fit into that? And where do your students fit into that? And how can you be the most supportive that you can be of that process for them?
So personalizing the experience as well to teaching academic content is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, there's no way for it to not be personal. Well, one of the things, this idea of teaching with a sexual orientation is that we all do have sexual experiences, positive, negative, neutral. We all have sexual orientations that we feel positively, negatively, neutrally about. And and so we have to acknowledge that as facilitators, those exist in our world, and we can put a wall between them and our professional identities. But if we are going to do that, put that wall in, it has to be explicitly chosen. And there are times when we do want that wall there, but we have to acknowledge the personal in order to build the wall between ourselves and our professional selves. And there are times we don't want to wall. And so how do we make sure that there's doors and windows where and when we want them to be, and they're appropriately open and closed, depending on our setting and our situation? This feels like the perfect month to be diving into those questions.
How about homework? What kinds of assignments can participants expect?
It's going to be a lot of reflection. So a lot of thinking through the readings, thinking through the videos, reflecting on what they mean personally and reflecting on what they mean professionally. What are those gems and those nuggets that you can take from each of these really rich and varied resources to have them be useful to you? Because the goal is for this to be a very applicable, useful certificate. I'm not out here just kind of fluffing my lips for like whatever. And I think that you don't want to spend your time, also just like reading things and then letting them fly away. So where can we nail down the actionable items from each of these content areas in ways that are useful to us?
And when you think about participants that might enroll in your course, what kind of classroom are you hoping to assemble? Who is this most relevant for? And what kinds of students are going to excite you as an instructor?
What kind of students don't excite me as an instructor, Bill Taverner? Like, I am just like, yeah, just bring it. Just bring your full self and be excited to show up. I think that that's maybe the thing that I find the most exciting are students who are curious and who are engaged. And as long as those two things are present, everything else is just details. So I'm excited for folks who are heterosexual to be there. I'm excited for folks who are queer to be there. I'm excited for folks who are asexual to be there. I'm excited for everybody to show up in this room and to use these resources and this framework that I'm creating to have an interesting dialogue and to dig deep into topics that matter. Uh, and I mean, that's the space that I want. Ideally, as a facilitator, what I'm doing is creating a container where really interesting things can be made. I think of myself as like I get out the soup pot and I get out a whole bunch of ingredients, some of which are maybe a little wacky, like, right? Like, okay, like let's throw some chocolate on that table. See if anybody wants to chop it up and throw it in. I don't know, maybe it's going to be good. And inviting the then, ideally curious and engaged participants to get with me and dig into that process of conversation and whatever their personal or professional trajectories maybe.
You're making me think of one of our other certificate programs where there was a participant who then took the course, and now she's doing her own courses on based on what she learned, which are different than what the course that she attended, but just putting her own flavor and applicability and community that she wants to emphasize. And so I can also see people taking these gems, these nuggets of wisdom, these, as well as the stuff that they may not necessarily find useful. I think if you watch a webinar that doesn't really resonate with you, there's so much learning you can take from that experience as well, and then apply it to, well, how do I want this to affect webinars that I may want to give, or my in-person students at whatever age. So I think that there's a lot of applicability there as well. Is there anything else that you want to tell us about the program?
Well, I actually just thought as you were talking, like it is all remote. And so, it does need to be folks who are ready to engage in the remote structure. And so, as much fun as it would be to be in person, I do think that it's more accessible to more people in this remote format. And so, being prepared to actually have your camera on and, it's okay to have, a water bottle with you and not feeling awkward about that, keeping your mute off so that everyone can hear you. And I'm hoping to create that really engaging remote format while maintaining some of the best pieces of dialogue that we can experience in the in-person environment in that online space.
Having worked with you so much, I know that the classes that you teach are interactive, they're fun, and people, really wind up having very rich conversations.
Yeah, so we will be very interactive at all times. I don't want to hear myself talking for, an hour a week for, 8 weeks in a row. That sounds very dull for everybody. So, we are looking for that, like, let's do this together kind of impulse.
What a way to spend Pride Month. Well, thank you again, Dr. Reen, for joining us and telling us a little bit about this course. The program is called Certificate Program in Sexual Orientation and Sexuality Education, the Pedagogy of Pride, Parades, and Protests. And it will take place throughout Pride Month on Tuesdays and Thursdays from 4 p.m. to 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time. The program includes 24 credits, 12 of them live and 12 of them asynchronously. Thank you again, Dr. Rain.
Thanks for having me, Bill.